Welcome to History Hack. If you didn't know by now, we are the revolution. That means we're sharp, witty, lots of fun, but it also means that we're essentially the peasants in Les Mis huddled round a table in the corner of the bar with no money. If you enjoy the show, please do support us. We have a Patreon account by which you can donate a small monthly sum in appreciation of what you're hearing. Alternatively, we have Ko-fi, in which you can just do a one-off donation as a thank you if you particularly enjoy a certain episode. Either way, we massively appreciate all of your support. Hope you enjoy the show.
Hello, welcome to another episode of History Hack. You have me, and of course, you've got the fabulous Christopher. Christopher, who have we got on today?
Seeing as both of us were out of our depths just the other day when we talked to Nick Morton about medieval history, I thought just for a change, I'd throw us out of our depth again. We have Stuart Ellis Gorman, who is a regular award-winning contributor to Reddit's Ask Historians and reviews history books for publication. He's had a long interest in longbows and crossbows, and he's here to talk about his book, The Medieval Crossbow, A Weapon Fit to Kill a King. So, Stuart, welcome to History Hack. How are you doing?
Very good. Thanks for having me. Always happy to talk about crossbows. Everyone in my family is sick of hearing me talk about crossbows, so any opportunity to talk to anyone else, any poor unsuspecting sap who's prepared to listen to crossbows talk is okay with me.
I'm again out of my depth with 1, medieval history, 2, military history. So let's learn something new, or at least teach me something new.
I will do my best.
So if we get down to the nuts and bolts of it, how does the crossbow go? The longbow's fairly straightforward. Put the arrow in, pull it back, let it go. That's probably a bit more technical than that. But
no, do you know what? I think you might have to really layman terms it down, because what is the difference between a crossbow and a long? Right now, that's my question. What is the difference between the two of them? I have no idea.
So the difference between a crossbow and a longbow, or just any old bow, is the crossbow is attached to a stock. So kind of like you imagine a modern gun stock. And in many ways, the stocks that guns use are developments from crossbows. Then there's within crossbows, there is a debate, I would say, between what a crossbow is and what we would call an arrow guide. So the distinction in that would be the existence of a trigger. So an arrow guide could be a bow that's just stuck on the side of a piece of wood, and that you use that to kind of help you draw the bow, versus a crossbow would have an actual trigger. So it would lock the string in place, and then you put the bolt, and then you can wait for your shot. So when you pull back a longbow, you have to hold it at full tension, waiting for your shot. So you tend not to do that, particularly as bows get heavier. And you think about like English longbows at Agincourt, you're not holding them steady for long periods of time. That would wreck your body. Crossbows don't have that problem. The weapon does that for you. So there's some debate about whether or not a crossbow is just a bow mounted onto some form of stock, or if it has to have that trigger to make it work. Within crossbows, there are substantial variations in design. You have probably one of the most fundamental is the kind of classic Chinese design of a crossbow, which the bow mounted on a traditional Chinese crossbow, we're talking kind of Han era, 4th century BC, up through kind of, they stay fairly consistent for much of the BC era. I'd be a little bit more in my depth into AD, because Chinese history is not my specialty. But the early Chinese crossbows, the bow is just the same as a normal hand bow you would shoot. So they've just taken a hand bow that they would often use. Usually they'd be composite bows for ancient China, and they've stuck it on a stock and they put a trigger on it. And one of the things that this feature is that bows like that need to be drawn a very long distance to shoot. So the trigger is at the way end of the crossbow stock. So basically the bit that it sits against your shoulder if you're shooting it, that's where you pull it back to. And the flip side of that, in the European crossbows that we know, mostly kind of high medieval, late medieval, they're custom built bows. So in the case of the wooden crossbow, you would have, like, it's often made of yew, which is the same material a longbow is made of, but it's like if you made a really short, really strong yew bow, and the crossbow trigger tends to be about halfway down the stock. So you have a very fundamental different design. Like you can't draw a yew crossbow with your hands. It's just not possible. Because, for example, a longbow might be 150 pounds over 28 or 30 inches, like a really powerful longbow. So that's kind of the upper end of longbows. So you have to think you have to pull back 150 pounds of force. You're doing it over 30 inches. So it's not actually a flat progression. It actually gets harder the more further back you pull, but it is over time, versus a kind of a yew composite or yew crossbow could be 150 in like 10 inches. So now you're doing all of that work in a much shorter space. So it's not very practical. So that's why you tend to have devices to help you draw them, and you have this trigger to hold it steady. In addition to that, we have composite crossbows, which are a composite bow is a bow that's made of multiple materials. Generally, when we talk about them, we're talking about a bow that's made of wood, a type of horn, animal horn, and sinew. And you have a core made of wood, and you put horn along the back, which is the bit that faces, along the belly. Sorry, the belly is the bit that faces the archer, and then sinew on the other side. And basically, the horn is harder to compress, and so you get more draw weight out of less material. And the sinew gives it an elasticity and also helps it hold together. Composite crossbows use the same materials. They use them in quite different ways. There's a lot of different structures, and we don't fully know exactly how that all works, partly because they've only really started replicating it recently. The crossbow is a little understudied, and you can't experiment with surviving ones. They've all dried out, and no museum's going to let you break their crossbows like that. And then there's also finally steel crossbows, a very late medieval invention, which is the bow is made of steel, and that has its own properties. It works kind of like a large steel spring. Those are kind of your main types of crossbows. There's lots of little nuances. There's weird crossbow variations. There's bullet crossbows, which are designed to shoot bullets instead of bolts. There's gun crossbows, which are crossbows that have guns built into them, which is a fun 16th century fad that doesn't really stick around because it's not very practical, but it's very cool. And you have things like trap crossbows, which are crossbows you would set up, and usually for hunting, you would hunt often animals for their pelts. So if they stepped into a hole, it would shoot them with the crossbow. So there's a bunch of different kinds of crossbow as well.
From memory, it's been a long time since I did sort of Middle Ages stuff. The crossbow had a much slower rate of fire than the longbow, though, didn't it?
Yeah, so generally, there's again always room for debate here, but I mean, as a rule, it's much slower. How much slower depends on what devices you're using with it. So crossbows, by default, a certain pound crossbow, you could just pull it back with your hands and just pull it back with your arms. Often, one of the first developments we see in crossbows is a stirrup that you stick on the front of the crossbow to put your foot in. Because before that, you're standing on your bow, which isn't great for the bow. And it's also actually just quite awkward to do. People have tried doing it because the bow is not flat. So you're standing on this horrible round thing as you're trying to balance and pull it up. It's awful. So the stirrup was an early development. And then very soon after that development is called a belt hook, which is a hook on your belt. So then you hook the string onto the belt hook, and then you put your foot in the stirrup. And this lets you use your legs to pull the string back rather than your arms, and your legs are significantly more powerful than your arms. So we see variants on that, but then we also see with the windlass and the Kraniken, which are two kind of big cranking devices. The Kraniken is like a big metal gear mechanism, and the windlass is more like a winch. Just think of it like it's like a fairly fancy winch. And so these let you draw these really intensely powerful crossbows, but they're very slow. I mean, you'd be lucky to be doing 2 shots a minute with them. A lot of the time, particularly you see experienced archers using them, 2, maybe 3 if they're very good. And longbows can shoot much faster than that. But the kind of flip side of that is probably those aren't the most. If you're in a battle situation, probably most of your crossbowmen aren't using that. They're probably using more of a belt hook setup that draws faster. And the other factor is that while a longbow can shoot, it's kind of 6 arrows a minute thing. You only have so many arrows, and that's exhausting. So probably most battles, archers aren't shooting off at max rate, and crossbows are probably a little bit faster. So there is a difference, and there's a potential. If you need a lot of arrows to go somewhere very quickly, archers can provide that with bows in a way they can't with crossbows. But I think there's an often exaggeration in popular imagination about just how disparate they were.
That actually makes sense. So I kind of have a great idea. So talk to us about how the crossbow is depicted in art, and what can it tell us about the weapon?
Yeah, so one of the challenges we have studying the crossbow, particularly in the kind of high Middle Ages, is we have a very limited archaeological record. This is also a problem we have with the longbow and a lot of weaponry in the Middle Ages, is that none of this stuff doesn't survive in very high rates. So when you get to kind of the 15th, 16th, 17th century, there's lots of crossbows. But if you're looking earlier, kind of 11th, 12th, 13th, 14th, then you don't get that kind of same coverage. And that means you have to find evidence somewhere else. And medieval art is great for that. It's a challenging source to work with because medieval art is not particularly concerned with realism, I would say. It has a very flexible relationship with that. But at the same time, it can tell you a lot about how society understood the crossbow, what their relationship was. And it's also great for things like I was talking about belt hooks and these spanning devices. There's a lot of depictions of medieval soldiers and fighters using these devices, so they can provide a lot of insight into how they were used when they first emerged, because often we don't have archaeological evidence for when does the belt hook first appear, but we can look at illuminated manuscripts and we can see that there are belt hooks in, this century, 11th century images, and that kind of gives you at least they're from here. They might be older than that, but at least they're from here. So it's a really useful tool for kind of filling in when you don't have the archaeology. It's also on a man-sized rabbit who's hunting people. So you have to kind of, I think that's part of the joy of it, is that the art is so weird. Record or getting a different perspective that the archaeology record won't provide for you. At the same time, it's something you have to be careful about using because, as I say, it's all a bit odd. And so you have scenes of this is a really interesting depiction of, belt hooks in art, and you get to see some truly bizarre stuff. That's great. And then you do have to then kind of also be aware that it's not hyper realistic, or it's not like working with photography now. So for modern sources, so it's this fun aspect of the job, though.
If you can find it, it's a bit of a sidestep. If you can find it on Twitter, it's a medieval manuscript art feed, and they post some of the pictures, and there's rabbits riding snails chasing humans. It's brilliant. Some of the medieval
rabbits hunting people, and it's brilliant. It's across many manuscripts. It's clearly some kind of medieval joke that they loved. It's great. I love it.
It's like this bored monk doing the illumination. But you mentioned China before, because I'd always thought that crossbows were a European invention. But what were the origins, and when did they first start to appear?
So the crossbow is an ancient Chinese weapon originally. It probably is 5th, 6th century BC. We don't know exactly when it first appears, but there's lots of evidence from the end of the Warring States period. For example, the famous terracotta army of the Qin Emperor that has lots of crossbowmen in it. So we have definitely, by the end of the Warring States, Qin dynasty, there's plenty of crossbows. Sun Tzu, who's difficult to date, but in The Art of War, he makes a metaphor using a crossbow about armies being ready to pounce like a pulled back crossbow, basically, they're ready to shoot. So he's got kind of this crossbows are fairly normal reference point then, even in he's kind of spring and autumn period, maybe, or Warring States, he's a bit difficult to date. So certainly 6th century BC China, definitely crossbows. It could even be 7th, 8th century. And I think we might even find more archaeological evidence as more digs are being done in China that will push it back even earlier. In Europe, it's trickier. So our first really good evidence, so our first textual evidence of crossbows in Europe is in Vegetius, who's a late Roman military thinker. He writes kind of about 4th century. He's really influential throughout the Middle Ages. His Manual of Wars remains very popular. So he has a couple of references to crossbows. They're not very detailed, and they're often, he talks about manuballista, arcuballista, these kind of small ballista. And this is a fun part of doing crossbow research, is that the word for crossbow in Latin is ballista, but you also might be aware of this very large torsion-powered siege weapon called a ballista. And it's just the same word, basically. So it's a lot of context figuring out when do they mean ballista. And when you get to the kind of later Middle Ages, ballista generally means crossbow, but there's a lot of periods where it could be either, and it's very difficult. So this is where this arcuballista, manuballista, kind of bow ballista, or smaller ballista, is generally interpreted as meaning crossbow. But we don't have any archaeological evidence really for most of the early Middle Ages. We have a couple of depictions of Romano-Gallic art, so kind of probably 5th, 6th century, and then we have a Pictish standing stone that has probably a crossbowman on it. Again, this is where we're getting into some tricky art interpretations because it's very abstracted. So it could just be a very weird depiction of a bow, but generally has been interpreted as crossbow. I think it's about 8th century. And we have a few archaeological finds in Scotland. So it's probably present in the early Middle Ages. We know very little about its style. And there's been some debate about, is it imported from China at some point? Probably around the time of Vegetius, there's some contact between Rome and China. Or is it descended from this ancient Greek weapon called the gastrophetes, which is the belly bow, which is this big kind of bow weapon that looks a bit like a crossbow. It was spanned by, it has this kind of rod that you would push into the ground, and then you would put the other end of the bow against your stomach, and you would lean down, and that would push the string back into place. But that's this extremely obscure Greek weapon. The references to it tend to be kind of Roman era. So it's probably more likely that it comes from China, where we have tons and tons and tons and tons of crossbows. But because we don't have we don't have very little for what the Gastrophetes looks like. We don't really know much about what these early Roman crossbows. We kind of have the Romano-Gallic stones are our best source, but there's two of them. Only one of them is very reliably dated. One of them was dug up in a site, so we kind of know when it's from. The other one was just found in a basement in the 18th century. Like one of these kind of finds, you're like, oh, this is definitely like 1500 years old, but I don't know from when. So those give us a bit more insight, but we don't really, because we can't, one of the things we don't have Chinese crossbows have this very distinctive trigger that's made of bronze. That's very different from the trigger that's used in the High Middle Ages crossbows. And we don't have bronze Chinese style triggers being dug up in early medieval sites in Europe. So it creates this kind of like, it's almost there, and it's originally from China. It comes to Europe in like the 3rd, 4th century, and then it kind of doesn't really catch on in Europe until the 11th century for whatever reason. But we don't really have quite all the pieces there to link it all up. So there's still some kind of unknowns.
Okay, so we've got King Henry I of England and his great-grandson Richard I, who had two very different experiences of the crossbow. Can you tell us about both of them?
Yeah, so this is kind of where the book got its subtitle from. So the book is The Medieval Crossbow Weapon Fit to Kill a King. And not actually very many monarchs died of the crossbow, but more than you might think. And it first came from Richard I, but I'll do Richard I second. King Henry I is an interesting guy. He's the son of William the Conqueror. He takes over after his brother, William II, is killed in a hunting accident, probably by a longbow. But it's always the chance it's a crossbow. Not all the sources say, but it's probably he got shot by a bow in a hunting accident. And there's a bit of a, stink about it because his brother inherits him, and you kind of have this certain, like, was he assassinated? Was it an accident? I mean, dying in hunting accidents was a thing. So anyway, Henry I's other kind of interesting, I guess we could say, quirk or deplorable character quality is he had 13 illegitimate children, which I think might be a royal record, certainly for the English monarchy. It's up there for European monarchs. But the story comes from one of his daughters, Juliana de Fontevraud, or Juliane de Fontevraud, who was married to an illegitimate son of a French nobleman in Bretul. And basically, throughout Henry I's reign, there was a lot of unrest. So he's having to deal with this revolt. And at the same time, Juliane and her husband Eustace want the castle of Ivry, which is a castle in northern France, and are kind of making noises about rebelling if they don't get it. And so they reach an agreement with Ralph Harnack, who's the constable of Ivry, that they will do like basically a hostage swap. So Juliane and Eustace's two daughters go to Ralph, and Ralph's son goes to them. And then they'll get kind of control over the castle with this agreement being that this is fairly standard medieval politics, that you would swap people to make sure someone meets an agreement. And then for reasons not totally clear, Eustace decides to blind Ralph's son, which is a pretty big no-no. You're not supposed to do that. And so Ralph, understandably extremely annoyed, wants to respond, which you would do in a hostage situation, is inflict the harm on your hostages. His problem is that his hostages are the granddaughters of Henry I, the king, who he is allied to. Now, they are the illegitimate, but they're still his granddaughters, right? So he checks with Henry. Henry gives him permission, so he blinds the daughters and cuts off the ends of their noses, and then they swap them back, basically. So he sends them back, through it. So, horrible things to poor children who don't deserve this. And Juliane and Eustace then rebel, basically. So they go to Juliane to the town of Bretul and holds a position in the citadel. Henry I comes to the city with an army, and she's gotten there before him, but the citizens just open the gates, which is a thing that happens sometimes. They're like, we actually don't want to be involved in this civil war with the king, so we're going to open the gates. So the garrison and Juliane flee into the attached castle, the citadel, and Juliane basically decides to ask Henry for a talk. And then the descriptions about how they meet are not clear, but what the circumstances. Is she on the walls talking to him, or did she come out? But what is clear is that she brings a crossbow and she takes a shot at him. And she misses. But she has tried to kill her father. And then, immediately afterwards, she flees the castle by getting lowered down outside the moat, falls in the moat, climbs out, gets on a horse, and escapes. And eventually they're all reconciled. and she eventually takes up life in an abbey when her husband dies. But it's this bizarre kind of sequence of events, and you don't really get a lot of like children of kings trying to kill them with crossbows. So it really struck me as like this kind of fascinatingly odd story. And then Richard I is noteworthy because he actually is killed by a crossbow. So he has two bad crossbows. Well, he probably has more than two, but two famous bad crossbow experiences. One of them was on the Third Crusade. Well, after the fall of the city of Acre, which is the big siege of the Third Crusade, he marches in his army south towards Jaffa, which is the nearest port to Jerusalem. And there's a large battle. There's several large skirmishes and battles there. And at one point along that journey, he gets shot in the side with a crossbow, but it doesn't really go very deep. He ends up, he keeps campaigning. He fights. It seems fine. He goes through his armor, but it doesn't go through with enough force to seriously injure him. The kind of more famous story comes that he's besieging this small city in the north of France. I think it's in Aquitaine, actually, in kind of central France. Because by this point, he's the daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine, so he owns like most of France and his lands. And there's all these like really salacious stories about why he's there, involving like secret golden idols and stuff. But he's besieging the city. He goes out to he's preparing to storm the castle. Like, they've been there for a bit. It's not a very big castle. He's got a big army. And he goes out to have a look at the walls. And there's debate about whether he decided not to wear his armor or what. Like, usually there's a guy who brings a big shield to kind of like walk near you if you're doing this. And then maybe the failure is that guy. But anyway, someone peeks out over the wall, sees him, takes a shot. And the crossbow bolt gets buried in his shoulder. The bolt doesn't kill him. He survives that, but then the wound gets gangrenous, and that kills him because it's not a lot medieval medicine can do if you get a bad infection. They are actually pretty good at stitching up wounds, but gangrene is game over. So they end up taking the citadel while he's dying, but he does die out there. And there's lots of kind of stories. There's a story by one chronicler about how the person who shot him is brought before him, and he pardons him before he dies. But then they have him flayed alive after the king is dead, which also is probably just a story made up after the fact, because the sources disagree even about who it was who shot him, or if he knew that it was the king when he shot. But he's a very famous monarch for many reasons, and for crossbow history, it's because he actually got shot and killed by a crossbow. Because usually with these kind of monarch deaths, you killed it, or royal deaths, if you're assassinated, it's with a knife, or if you're killed in battle, it's because somebody else cuts you down. It's very rare they actually get killed at range by a missile weapon.
Fired by a peasant.
Yeah,
they much prefer a more noble end, another knight or a lord, rather.
Dying of gangrene in the middle of nowhere is really nobody's idea. He's also buried in like 3 places because of it. Because at the time they would bury your insides near your death because they cut it all out so you don't rot. And then his heart is somewhere else, and his body is in the famous abbey with Eleanor of Aquitaine and his father.
The crossbow's not only used in Europe, though, is it? The Crusaders take them with them off to the Holy Land. How does it fare as a weapon against the Saracens?
So it's a fairly instrumental weapon in the Crusades, and it features in a lot of crusading tactics. I mean, it's fairly prominent across Europe, but the Crusades has a very distinct dynamic, which is that there's large numbers of mounted horse archers that they're fighting, which is not something that's normal in Western European warfare for the most part. You get a bit of it in parts of Iberia, but it's the kind of dominant style of warfare that they're fighting against many Crusades, particularly against the Turks in the north, and then also just kind of across Arab tribes and Bedouins and all that. So one of the kind of main tactical dynamics is the Crusaders are trying to march their army somewhere to fight a battle, and they're being harassed basically all the time, because if you can wear down your opponent before the battle happens, that's always advantageous. So, maybe, Saladin has set up a siege somewhere, and the Crusaders have to get an army to relieve the siege. He's going to harass you the whole way there. Or like with Richard I. Richard I leads this very famous kind of, it's called a fighting march, where he has to get from Acre to Jaffa, and he's just going to be he's got his army marching along the coast, and off the coast he has ships with supplies that will come in and resupply him periodically, but he's got to basically get through extended enemy territory where he's going to be attacked at a low level all the time. And the thing the crossbow is great for in this is it can hold them back, because you can just keep your loaded crossbow together, because they're going to ride really close to you, shoot as close as they can for maximum effect, and then ride away before you can chase after them. That's kind of the classic way of doing this harassing. And the crossbow lets you wait till they come really close, and then shoot at them. So that creates this kind of dynamic where how close is safe, and it gives you a counter attack to them. So you see lots of crossbowmen being very essential to these kind of tactics. And then once you get into battle, it comes in again. So Richard I does actually take Jaffa, and then eventually takes Ascalon, but then he goes back to Acre, and Saladin comes out from Jerusalem to besiege Jaffa, and Richard eventually leads this kind of, in 1192, he leads this big kind of amphibious landing on the beaches of Jaffa to drive them off, and that's where he fights the Battle of Jaffa. And the Battle of Jaffa, we have descriptions of how he has, basically his whole army is Italian in this, because it's all the warriors from the ships. He has a very small number of cavalry, and he has lots of crossbowmen and spearmen, and he basically lines the spearmen up, and between each spearman he puts 2 crossbowmen, one whose job is to shoot, and one whose job is to reload. And they stay there and they hold position while Saladin kind of does this fake charging and shooting, eventually allowing for Richard to form his cavalry and wait for the right moment, and then they break formation and charge into Saladin's army, and they drive him off. And it's one of it's kind of the final battle they fight of the Third Crusade, because at that point Richard is a bit broken, has to go home. So it's that kind of dynamic which is made very iconic in the Third Crusade, but you actually see it quite a bit across the Crusades, this being a very essential weapon to the tactics they develop.
So Chris has written the questions here, and I wasn't actually expecting crossbow was banned as a weapon. So why was it banned?
So there's the story of the crossbow being banned, and it's a little bit contentious. So we're in the Second Lateran Council, our favorite. I'm sure I don't have to explain the councils to you, right? I'm sure we're all very familiar with our first, second, third Laterans. No. Second Lateran, it's a papal council in 1139. It was originally called to resolve an issue with there being 2 popes, a classic medieval problem. One of the popes had the decency to die first, so then it became a discussion about something else. And it issues a series of edicts, and one of them, the one that has kind of caught the most attention throughout the years, is this edict saying that you shouldn't use bows or crossbows in InterChristian warfare. So it includes a ban on both ranged weapons, and it also and it's very specific, it's InterChristian warfare. So if you want to take your crossbow on Crusade, absolutely go nuts. Do it. It's great. We're huge fans of Crusades, but it's part of this broader movement that was trying to tamp down the amount of internal violence between nobility in Europe, which were kind of put forward first under this ideas of the peace of God and the truce of God, which were these movements in France in kind of the 10th, 11th century they started. And so the peace of God was to basically not attack non-combatants. So it was to establish this idea of non-combatants, like don't attack monks, don't attack priests, don't attack women, don't attack children. Ideally, don't attack peasants. Limit your war to just the other warriors. And then the truce of God was the idea that you shouldn't fight during holy feast days. So no fighting during Lent, no fighting during Advent, no fighting on holy days, which is most days. And actually in the Second Lateran Council has a ban that's basically like you can't fight battles except on like Tuesdays and Wednesdays. And so there's a bunch of bans at it. Now, one of the things about it is that like no noble follows these. Like they're not enforceable. And there's bans on, you're not supposed to engage in tournaments, you're not supposed to like hawk. It's all these rules about limiting noble behavior, and including this ban on weaponry. And none of them listen. Like this is, this is 50 years before Richard I is going to get shot and killed by one. Although it does there's a fun anecdote about Richard I, where there's this writer who's writing a bit later after he's writing his second biography of King Philip II of France, who's a rival of Richard I, and he writes this very elaborate poem about where the fates, the famous Greek fates, are spinning the thread of Richard's life, and they're going to cut it short and stuff. And he accuses Richard of introducing the crossbow to France, which I've always really enjoyed because it's like patently nonsense. Like they're writing about it in the Second Lateran Council 50 years before this. Obviously, it's not, but he sticks it in there anyway. Because why not? If you're gonna go all in on like pinning crimes on this guy, just do it. Why not? But yeah, so the more effective output of the Second Lateran Council is actually around things like this is when we see the idea of clerical celibacy enter the Catholic Church. Not specifically, like it's an idea that's in kind of the ether before this, but Second Lateran is part of this push for celibate clergy to stop things like bishoprics becoming hereditary. And then you also see a push against clerical marriage, and then it's a push against simony, which is the buying and selling of offices. So like paying someone to make you bishop is something they don't want you to do either. And that is actually like the much more successful output of these councils versus the kind of crossbow ban has caught the imagination, but it's much narrower than that. It also applies to bows, and nobody listens to it.
I suppose you don't get a representative of the Vatican turn up at the battle and go, all right, stop that, put that down. None of those.
I mean, they try that, but it never works.
But didn't the Vatican State have an army at one point? Did they?
Yeah, they do, and there's popes who lead armies to battle. It basically never goes well. Nothing about training to become a pope really prepares you to lead troops into combat. But there's some in the early modern period, and there's some in the medieval as well. There's popes against the Normans when they come to southern Italy, and they basically always get captured, and it goes really badly.
But moving on to other banned weapons, we end up getting gunpowder in Europe in 1326. Surely when you start getting basic, what are they called, harbour quasars, were most of the original ones? How did that affect the crossbow? Because wouldn't you think that would sort of take over?
So it's a slow progress. So in 1326 is our first definite guns are here. They're definitely from before. Again, it's an image of medieval art. We have a picture of a gun and a manuscript, a very discernible cannon, which shoots a giant bolt, a big arrow type thing, rather than bullets. Bullets actually come a little bit later. But so we definitely have gunpowder from the century before, and then guns from probably the early 1300s. And there's evidence that guns were probably used at the Battle of Crusades in 1346. So they catch on pretty quickly, but they're very, very niche for the 14th century, particularly. Gunpowder, guns are cheap. Gunpowder is insanely expensive. So gunpowder is made of 3 ingredients. It's made of charcoal, sulfur, and saltpeter. Charcoal, easy to get. People make charcoal for all sorts of purposes in the Middle Ages. There's lots of charcoal. Sulfur, not too hard to get. You get it from volcanoes. So there's, Italy, particularly Sicily. There's lots of sulfur around Mount Etna, and there's also lots of sulfur in Iceland. So it's more expensive, but it's readily available. Saltpeter, they initially, for the 14th century, they don't know how to make it. So the Germans figure out how to make it kind of in the late 14th, very early 15th century, and actually keep it quite secret for a while. So it takes a long time to spread. Even England's trying to kind of get saltpeter manufacture going in the Tudor era. So it takes quite a while for them. They're very good at locking it down. But so in the 14th century, gunpowder is just too expensive for this to be a common weapon. We see lots of experimentation with guns. Lots of weird guns get developed and various ideas. But it's a artillery piece primarily, mostly going to show up at sieges. You see a little bit they try and use it at Crusades in a battle, but the kind of even the people who are writing about it are it scares the horses a bit. That's all it really does. You can't shoot it fast enough or accurately enough to really be a threat. And the 15th century is really when you see gunpowder artillery come into their own as a siege weapon, particularly in the kind of the latter end of the 100 Years' War. It becomes more and more important how sieges are conducted. But you only see the arquebus, which is kind of the default kind of personal firearm, come into play about mid-15th centuries when it becomes more normal with the kind of arrival of matchlocks, which are, they have a burning wick, basically, that you hold, and the trigger lowers that into the pan, and then it shoots from there. And that still has problems, it's not very good in wet climates, because you have to have this open flame element to it. It's still quite niche. It's quite difficult to use. There's this idea that gunpowder, you could train someone to use it and they'd be effective in a minute. That's very true of kind of modern muskets, where once you have cartridges and that kind of, you rip it with your teeth, you ram it in the barrel, then you cock the thing back and you shoot. Early gunpowder guys, they had to mix their own gunpowder for much of the early stage, because it took them a while to figure out how to store it, because those ingredients will unsift if you just store them together in a big barrel. There's techniques you need to use to stop them unmixing, which they only kind of discover later. So it's a real specialist job early on. So for the most part, crossbows continue to be the main weapon of ranged warfare, along with longbows. And only kind of from the mid to late 15th century do you start seeing arquebuses kind of coming in. But what you see for a lot of that early period is arquebuses intermixed with crossbows. So we start seeing development of units that would use both. And you see that certainly up to the 1530s. Crossbows even kind of continue to be used later than that. And particularly in things like the conquistadors in Spain continue to use crossbows for a long time, and they use both weapons together. And theory, I think what you get is crossbows are more reliable. Crossbows don't misfire. These early guns, they have a misfiring problem. And they also can be slower. I mean, you talk about slow and reload for a crossbow. For a gun, it's going to be slower, particularly as the barrels begin to foul up if you're shooting them a lot. The upside of a gun is that it is way more lethal. Like, guns are just substantially more dangerous than any other weapon you have for this period. So what you're getting is a much higher level of lethality for probably slightly lower accuracy and greater cost. So you see them coexist for quite a while before eventually the crossbow fades out. But then it still kind of persists in some areas, like naval warfare. Everything's a lot wetter. So crossbows and bows continue to be quite useful into the 1570s. You know, you have arquebuses, but you kind of want that fallback of like, I want something that if we all get wet, still works. So you do see a bit of redundancy as well. There's a famous story from the 1565 siege of Malta where it starts raining. The rains come early. And so at the end of the summer, they get these deluges of rain. And the hospitallers basically go, we have this armory full of crossbows we haven't been using because we used to be like a really crossbow heavy. Even like 30 years ago, it was standard training to learn how to use a crossbow to fight on the galleys. So they crack the armory open and they pull out all their crossbows and they're like, okay, crossbows to the front, let's bring out the tried and true reliable weapon. Yeah.
We did sort of promise Eleanor a little bit of unrelenting death and genocide. So just briefly, guns also give you the psychological, when the Spanish go to the New World, you have that psychological thing of fire sticks. So the Aztecs who've never seen this are suddenly, well, geez, they're actually firing lightning at us, and you don't get that so much in Europe, not after the first few times.
No, but they are still they're pretty horrible to be on the other end of, and you hear a lot of like at the Battle of Lepanto, which is this big naval battle, 1571. When your ships get close and if you get that full blast of gun to the face, it's just like devastating to the front lines. You just like, so the front line are all going to get killed, but line 2 will be fine because they don't reload quickly. So,
line 2 are just surrounded by dead and mangled and wounded in front of them. So we mentioned it.
2 is so charming, by the way. Can I just add that?
It's medieval weapons. That's what they're for. We mentioned it a little while ago. What happened at the Battle of Crécy? If I remember correctly, and this is years ago, there were Flemish crossbowmen on the French side.
Italian.
Close.
Yeah. I mean, there actually are quite famous and successful Flemish crossbowmen. The crossbow guilds of Flanders are quite influential, but Flanders and France have a troubled relationship. So at this point, I think they're allied with the English in 1346. But yeah, so the Battle of Crécy is kind of one of the main turning points in the 100 Years' War. It's the first big English victory, and up until this point, England has spent an insane amount of money to achieve absolutely nothing. So the reason the 100 Years' War is 100 years long, a little bit can be placed on Crécy, because if it goes the other way, the war probably fizzles out. But there's a famous bit at the start of it where that gets talked about a lot when we talk about crossbows, because it's the crossbowmen and the English longbowmen duel. This is the first great victory of English longbows, at least on like a grand scale. There's some smaller battles in kind of internal strife, and particularly in the Scottish border, but this is like the big deal. This is a really big medieval battle. They don't actually stay this big for very long, because the next year the Black Death arrives, talking about fun mass death, and we have a third fewer people. So when you skip ahead to like Poitiers, which is 10 years later, the battle is much smaller because there's just fewer people. Yeah. But at Crécy, the Genoese are sent forward to shoot first at the English. This is a fairly standard French tactic and tactic used elsewhere, where if you're going to have to be the offensive party, what you really don't want to be doing is charging into like a tight ranked formation where everyone's ready for you, because when you get there, you're tired and they're not, and that's bad. So crossbows and other missile troops are really useful for softening up the target basically before you hit them. So even if they're not necessarily directly killing, because when we get into the era of plate armor, which we are here, they're less and less effective at actually seriously harming or killing people, but they are extremely effective psychologically. Being shot at, even if you're in full plate and it doesn't penetrate you, if you're being hit by arrows and crossbows, it's miserable. Like it's imagine it being out in the worst hailstorm of your life, where 1 in every 50 times maybe the hail will penetrate your leg and you won't be able to walk anymore. It's really it's bad times. So, and it also shuts down communication. You can't talk to people because you have to have your visors down, and the medieval visors are very stifling. So it's a great tool for that, and that's what the English used their longbows for so effectively for so long, is to have this effect on mostly the French, but on other opponents as well. The problem is that the Genoese march forward, they shoot, the archers step forward and respond, and the Genoese are decimated. And then the French charge through the Genoese, by most accounts. I mean, one of the things that's both fascinating and absolutely horrible about Crécy as a battle is it was a huge deal at the time. It was very widely known to be a huge deal, so lots of people wrote about it, and none of them agree on what happened. So you have all these sources, some of which are written, like one of these is this Italian writer, Villani. He dies in 1347. He dies the next year. So he wrote this down like right after it happened, because he's dead after that. So it's like cutting edge. This is like front page breaking news journalism for a medieval chronicle equivalent of it. But he disagrees with loads of people, all people who are writing all the other times, just so there's pinning down exactly what happens is really difficult. But they generally accept the kind of default story is the Genoese before they shoot, they're shot back at, they kind of either are massacred or they just like decide this isn't worth it, and then the French kind of charge through them. Some versions have the French massacring the Genoese as they go. Other versions, they just kind of charge through them and it's just a chaotic mess without them actually attacking the Genoese themselves. And then the French knights are kind of destroyed by the English, and it's a really bloody battle because basically very few prisoners are taken. The King of Bohemia dies at it. He was apparently blind and had himself strapped to his horse and was charged forward in this kind of chivalric moment that people always talked about, and was not very well thought out. And so it's this big mess of battle, but at the start of it you have this crossbow duel, and it's one of the only times you have this very direct story about longbows on one side, crossbows on the other. People try to infer a lot from it, and it is interesting to look at it. But the other side of it is that Crécy is just like one of the worst days of French command. It's a complete disaster. Nothing goes right. Most versions of the battle, because one of the things some sources disagree on is when the battle happened during the day. Was it in the morning? Was it in the afternoon? Generally, it's thought that the French marched there. The English set up the day before, and the French marched there that morning and then fought there, rather than waiting a day, which is kind of what they recommended they should do, is rest, fight the battle the next day. There's thoughts that maybe the Genoese would often go to battle wearing quite heavy armor and bringing this thing called a pavise. A pavise is this really big shield that you would just stick on the ground in front of you, and when you're reloading your crossbow, you crouch behind it so that the other guy shooting at you hits your shield instead of hitting you. So it's kind of like bringing your own barricade to a battle. And there's some versions you would have a guy whose job it would be carry the shield in front of you. Other versions, they just stick the shield in the ground. And there are different tactics that they would use with it. And so they were apparently all on the baggage train. So the Genoese went forward with none of their proper protection, having marched all day. And it may have been kind of muddy and miserable. And basically, it was the worst performance they could put forward. But it's still a very interesting battle for looking at the use of archery and combat and this kind of. And one of the things, the Genoese crossbowmen were a very popular mercenary force, and they remained a very popular mercenary force. Edward III, who wins the Battle of Crécy, then goes on to take the city of Calais, which is held by the English until the reign of Bloody Mary. So it's the longest holding they have in France, because when they lose everything else, the Hundreds War, they keep Calais for longer. And within, later in his reign, I think in the early 1370s, he hires Genoese crossbowmen to defend Calais, because they'll work for anybody. They're mercenaries. And he clearly sees value in them. He's not like, oh, those Genoese that were terrible that one time. He's like, no, the Genoese crossbowmen are some of the best of the best. And sure, they had a bad day there, but I'm still willing to pay top dollar for them to defend my holdings that I took.
And even if they were the worst, they were all killed. So these
all those guys are dead.
I mean, I did hear, I don't want to say conspiracy theory, but someone suggested when I was at uni when we were talking about this that maybe the French happily rode them down because as mercenaries, if they're dead, you don't have to pay them. But
that is definitely an element of it. There's always that upside. Be like, hey, it's for people to pay. They become the thing later in the Middle Ages. They're like, you have to pay X amount up front because they stop taking payment at the end. They're like, oh no, wait, this doesn't work out for us. You have to pay us at least a certain amount before we go.
Yeah, I did this in the War of Independence. So this looks dangerous. We'll send the Hessians in first because we're paying for them, and we'll keep the British troops back, and we'll use them when we know we're going to win. Anyway. But so why does the crossbow eventually get phased out?
So the main kind of death knell of the crossbow is the advent of gunpowder and the adoption of the arquebus as the main weapon. And the arquebus is more deadly, and as arquebuses get better, as you get better reloading techniques, as you get sort of from matchlock, we have wheellock is added, which is the first device that doesn't need any kind of open flame to trigger. So wheellock is basically it's a disc that you would spin into place, and then you would lock a piece of pyrite against it usually, and it would spin and create a spark, and that would ignite instead. And then eventually from that you'll get the flintlock, which I think is what a lot of people the trigger mechanisms people would mostly recognize from these kind of old style guns. But you get more and more advanced triggers, which kind of reduce some of that damp issues. You get advances in the quality of gunpowder. In the kind of 16th century, they figure out how to make better and better, refine gunpowder better so that it doesn't have issues with dampness seeping into the powder itself and making it not work, which is always a problem. And just refining the saltpeter, because the saltpeter is actually several different types of chemical compounds. And so there's ones that you want that are better than others. So they learn how to refine that better. So gunpowder becomes cheaper, it becomes better and more reliable over the course of the 16th century. But the crossbow isn't really phased out evenly across Europe. So you see it like in France seems to largely stop using it in the 1530s. Kind of in the Italian wars where France is invading northern Italy. In a series of quite disastrous and horrifying wars that they fight with Italy and Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, and it's a horrible mess. Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, seems to phase them out at around the same time from military use. And I say this is all for military use, that it's kind of going away. Sweden is still using them at least into the 1550s, and kind of then begins to phase them out when they're in a war with Russia, and then kind of has to every so often like switches back to crossbows if they have like they run out of gunpowder shortage, they have gunpowder shortage or something. So they're still using crossbows a bit later. And then as well in things like colonial holdings, like Spain is still using crossbows to some degree in Central America and South America, certainly into the late 16th century. And I recently found that there's evidence that there are crossbows in Jamestown in North America in the early 1600s. So it's certainly like kind of lingering in certain areas, but it stops being a main weapon of war in kind of the mid 16th century. And for a point of reference, England officially retires the longbow in the 1590s. So they're actually quite late to get rid of that weapon, but it's kind of in part of the same movement. And one of the things we have for England that's really entertaining is that there's like a pamphlet war over the retirement of the longbow, and people arguing in pamphlets that the longbow was great. And back in our day, there's a lot of back in my day or back in my dad's day, you know, longbow men were men and they shot longbows, and other people being like, but guns are just better. And so it is contentious. And I say in the Siege of Malta in 1565, the Hospitallers used crossbows at a key point, and they probably used them more earlier to some degree. There's some evidence for at least minor crossbow use at the Battle of Lepanto in 1571. So it hangs around, but it is being phased out. And you certainly don't see the same widespread use. And you can see similar trends in the manufacture of crossbows. It becomes a decreasing demand as guns really take over and the tactics shift accordingly. We see the arrival of pike and shot, and the kind of a very brutal form of warfare, because guns are just way more lethal than anything that's kind of come before, and particularly at that range. So you see it's a very different style of fighting.
Yeah, I thought there was a school of thought that suggested that if the Royalist army in the 1640s had longbows and crossbows, they would have defeated Parliament a lot quicker than reliant on guns, but it's all a bit hypothetical. But we've come to the end of like the crossbow's lifespan. What is its legacy?
It's an interesting question, and one of the things that I think depends a lot on where you're from, because I think coming at this from an English language avenue, I mean, I think the longbow has this long and pronounced legacy, particularly with certain branches of English nationalism. This idea of the archer as an English national identity has been very popular for years. You see him equated to like the Tommy in the trenches in World War I, and this idea of him being a normal kind of everyday soldier fighting against the elites. That this myth that is built up about the archer, when in fact like archers weren't necessarily peasants. They would have been free people for the most part, and sometimes they would be younger siblings of nobles. So you would go to war with, like, you know, I'm the son of a senior noble, I go to war as a man-at-arms, and my kid brother is an archer. So that kind of thing. So there's a lot of different class dynamics in archery. But we have this kind of, in English, we kind of, I think, identify more with the longbow and see the crossbow as another weapon. But you see it in places like Switzerland, particularly, has a very strong association with the crossbow, with the myth of William Tell. And this idea of like the founding myth of Switzerland is tied up in the story of the crossbow. So I think it has a really interesting kind of national legacy in that way, of kind of a certain amount of, you know, English longbows are sort of a bit defined against crossbows. And then in Europe, you have some places that identify very strongly with crossbows. You also have this more kind of non-military aspect of the crossbow. So the crossbow was a very popular sporting weapon. I think I mentioned briefly the Flemish crossbow guilds were this guild. I think we mean of like craftsmen working together. These were more like social clubs. This is like the local shooting club where well-to-do burghers of the cities would get together and they would shoot crossbows. And they took the shooting very seriously. There were these huge tournaments between cities that would be held every year or every few years. And depending on how much you could afford, really, because they're expensive to put on, there would be free beer. If you accidentally shot someone and you were a member of the guild, you could not be punished for it. As long as you were in the exercising of your practice duties, you couldn't just like go around shooting people. But if you accidentally shot someone in target practice, it was not a crime. And they actually were a recruiting source for troops. One of the things about crossbowmen is they tended to be a slightly higher status than your average soldier. And they were paid more than longbowmen or more normal archers for that reason. So to kind of reflect certain higher status and higher quality of expensive equipment, I guess would be more accurate than quality. So, but like that remained popular after the end of the crossbow's military use. I mean, the shooting guilds survived through early modern Europe. There were crossbowmen still supplying them. The court at Dresden in Germany remained like they had huge shoot. They had this thing called Popinjay Shoot, where you erected this big pillar in the middle of the town or in the middle of a field near the town, and it has a bird on the top called Popinjay, and the goal is to shoot the bird off the pole. So you can see where the accidents come in immediately.
Yeah.
But it was like they had the Duke and then King would throw these huge Popinjay shoots up until the 18th century. Like it was a huge festival, and that remained a very popular element. And then they remained very popular for hunting. They're still a popular hunting weapon in some parts of North America and Europe. It remains a popular hunting weapon. In addition to other parts of the world, like it's a very popular hunting weapon in parts in West Africa. It has been for centuries. And because it's silent, it's much quieter than a gun. And so it has this longer term legacy. The crossbow has never really gone away. It stopped being used as a weapon of war, but it's been retained in popular imagination in some places and as a useful tool for hunting or for sport, entertainment throughout.
Stuart, that was really interesting. I've now been inspired to maybe take up archery, but do remind our listeners the name of your book.
Yes, my book is The Medieval Crossbow, Weapon Fit to Kill a King. It was published with Pen and Sword Books. Came out last year. You can also get it on most e-reader platforms.
Fabulous. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Our incredible guests give us 45 minutes of their time to join us and talk about their work or their new book. This is just a small taster. As a result, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest books, you can support them, and you can support us on History Hack. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep going and bring you more top-of-the-line guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/historyhack or search for us in the shop section. Thank you so much for your continued support. We really appreciate our listeners and supporters. So make sure you get down to the bookshop and grab yourselves a new book.